So you get back in here and you really get the sensation that this is actually a temperate rainforest. It's kind of a 360-degree sphere of chlorophyll. And what we're walking up to, it's my dream for what I think living should look like. So this space I finished a couple of years ago. I call it the Japanese Forest House. I wanted to see how small of a space that I could make feel big. And so what you're looking at is a 14-foot by 16-foot template. It's 200 square feet. The architectural component of it is influenced by the Japanese minka, which are their traditional tall straw-baled houses where they have kind of a small understory and a huge ponderous roof that comes down. When I first built this thing, I had drawn in the plans a roof pitch that was slightly smaller and a body of the house that was slightly lower. But because I'm bad with math, I made a few construction math errors. And so I think it became out looking slightly more like a chalet than a Japanese house. But I think it's still pretty, and I think it still says what I want it to. I've worked as a carpenter over the years. I've built lots of code frame, simple balloon construction, sheetrock, and fiberglass insulation houses. It's someplace to live, but it doesn't nourish your soul, and it doesn't matter how beautiful you dress it up with the architecture. If you're always working with the same palette of materials, then there's only so much that you can do to really breathe life into the structure. One of the things that's so important to me when I'm creating structures is to start from scratch and actually mill the wood myself and search out the materials. You're looking at a really basic, simple timber frame. Over that timber frame, I nailed 1 by 20 chainsaw milled hemlock boards from a tree that fell over just behind the house right back here. And then over the top of that, I nailed this board-on-board cedar siding, which is the easiest siding in the world to make because all you're doing is taking rough slices off the tree. When you come across a rough sawn like 6x7 beam or a piece of live edge siding, suddenly your brain stops because you don't have any type of pre-existing template for what that is, and it really changes the way that you relate to space. On the inside of the house, I stapled spruce lath over the walls, and then we made plaster with sand and clay and spread that plaster all over the walls, and then we covered that plaster with milk paint. I like working with natural plaster because there's a richness to it that you just can't fake with sheetrock. All of the wood in here came from things that I salvaged. Some of it was trees that had blown down on a friend's property, and others of these were logs that were floating in the bay in the floods in the wintertime. And I went out there in my kayak and I started grabbing these logs and tying them off into rafts and setting anchors. And then I came back and we floated the logs onto a flatbed truck, and then we brought them back here and sawed them up. And so that allowed us to get some really, really unique, incredible quality lumber. This is clear Sitka spruce. This is nothing you'd ever be able to find at a lumber yard anywhere. And the 4 poles on the 4 corners of the building, including the log for the staircase, all came from the same tree. And I love it because even though it's really complicated mathematically to frame accurate timber framing into round natural poles, I mean, there's just a soul and an aesthetic to peeled cedar poles that you can't find anywhere else. It's a really small downstairs, but I found by keeping things really low, you can make a space feel bigger. And one of the things that the Japanese have is elevated tatami-style platforms. It could be an eating area, it could be a sleeping area, and then also if you move the table out of the way, it could be a sitting area for up to like 10 or 12 people. Whereas if you were to put Western-style furniture in here, you would have a love seat and a chair, and 3 people would be able to fit, and that furniture would really dominate the space. I don't make any claims towards real Japanese architecture. I basically just borrow little things that I like. But one thing that I really like about what you'll see in different spaces is you'll see odd little windows and doors at heights that don't make any sense, and sometimes they don't really go anywhere. And sometimes they're just there to let energy flow through the house. And it actually opens up. What this is a door to nowhere. It's just a beautiful little window door that goes straight out into the woods. And even though it doesn't have a real function, it does really wake up this whole corner of the house. The kitchen over here is very small. This is, believe it or not, the reason that I built this house. I found this beautiful little brass sink at the recycling yard. And I'm like, darn, this is such a cool sink, but I don't have anywhere to put it. And then everything developed from there. The counters are just rough sawn walnut slabs. I cut these slabs off of a tree that fell over in a woman's yard in Portland, Oregon about 10 years ago and dried them out slowly over time. And I never knew what I was going to do with them, but then this project started and everything came together and they decided to make perfect counters for the space. The one cool thing about really beautiful spaces, and it's also a curse, is that if you have a really sparse, simple space, if there's any clutter at all, it looks horribly out of place. And so you really want to keep it clean because it seems like you're ruining the aesthetic if you just leave crap all over the place. Our heat source for this little place is this beautiful little wood-fired cook stove. This is a tiny version of a full-size cast iron wood stove. It was made by Yodel originally in the 1950s, and they stopped casting these stoves. And then recently they started recasting some of them, and they're actually very efficient. It has a very small firebox. You can keep this place hot all day long off just a few handfuls of wood, and then you can also cook on it, and there's a real oven if you wanted to put something in there. I've never been able to bake cookies in there, but I had a friend who could bake perfect cookies every single time, so I know it's possible. The staircase I'm really proud of. This was something I wasn't sure I was going to be able to wrap my head around because I knew what I wanted, but the log like this is really heavy, and thinking about getting it in place and cutting it to the right size and keeping everything square was definitely a challenge. I ended up actually building a template around this log in the forest and then cutting the staircase in the forest before I got about 15 of my friends to carry it out. And then I milled some very thick old fir that I found floating in the bay, and we made the treads. And I have huge steel plates on the top and the bottom of the staircase to anchor it to the structure to make it stable and safe. I'm not the most patient person. I love to create things, but I love to actually own the things I'm creating, and I don't want it to take forever, and I don't want it to cost a lot of money, and I don't want it to be really difficult. Basically, all you're looking at here is alder trees and limbs that were cut from literally 20 feet away from where we're standing right now with a handsaw, and then brought up here. And I would very quickly make a little notch in the balustrade here, and then I would stick another piece on top, and then I would put a lag bolt down in there. And if you wanted to be a really fancy carpenter guy, of course you could recess that and peg it and make a really cute, complicated little timber frame joint. But that comes at a cost of 6 or 7 hours of work to do something that I can do in 5 minutes with a lag bolt that nobody even notices and that ends up being beautiful anyways. This whole rail here took me about 90 minutes to create, and that gives me more time to actually just go and enjoy my life. What I'm always looking for is ways to make things that are beautiful and functional that don't take a whole bunch of time and effort to put together. Another example of that same philosophy, this really simple table right here. All you're looking at here, if you can imagine the process, is a log sitting in the forest. Usually it's the butt of a log, a part that nobody would use for anything. And it's 2 cuts with a chainsaw, and then about 10 minutes with a sander, and then a light coat of oil, and then some interesting table legs screwed into the bottom of it. It's very sturdy, and it takes about an hour to build. That's kind of the magic of what I like to create. This simple shelf here is just made of construction grade 2x12s, just carefully notched around some 3x3s that I made out of some old fir that I had sitting around, and a couple of deck screws. Putting it all together, it took me about an hour and a half to build this shelf. So these here are probably the most actual Japanese thing that I've created in the whole house. These little lanterns I made out of some incense cedar that someone gave me, and it's not pegged together. The whole thing it was very painstaking. It's all carefully mortised and tenoned together, And then for the paper inside of the lamp, I actually got some handmade paper. I love living with things that have stories. And that up there is a kayak frame. This is what I do for a living. I teach people to build skin-on-frame kayaks. Whether or not you believe that local materials and things that are handcrafted have some spirit or soul imbued into them, just from a pragmatic point of view, every time you interact with something that you didn't purchase from the store, you're having a direct communication and you're getting stories from someone and you're meeting someone, and it adds this whole layer of richness to your life that you'd otherwise miss if you just walked into a store and paid $1 for something. And that's why I like to make things out of hand-built materials, and whenever I have time I like to find materials and put them together myself, because it's all of those interactions that currency erases. There's this mistaken impression that people have that somehow living a really rich, amazing, beautiful life isn't possible because it's going to be impractical or more expensive. What I've seen has been really the opposite. It's not harder, it's easier. It's not only a happier, more fun, more rewarding way to live, but it's cheaper.
One more thing I want to show you.
Oftentimes we don't even think about the circumstances we live in. It just becomes the new norm. What we're looking at here is actually the drain pipe for the kitchen sink. And this drains water directly into this planter box here. But then you take time and you step away from that and you live a life where you're focusing on living a life of beauty. And it infects you. And a beautiful small space like this, if somebody spends a little bit of time in it, they'll go back to their standard 2,000 square foot home and it won't feel right.